The sun shone kindly over St. Mary Mead that Thursday afternoon, painting the village green with a drowsy golden hue. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had organized her annual garden party, complete with sponge cake, cucumber sandwiches, and the slightly scandalous addition of homemade sherry. Ladies in flowered hats fanned themselves beneath the elm trees while the men discussed the cricket scores and nodded gravely at one another, as though the fate of England depended on the next over. Miss Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair near the edge of the lawn, her knitting needles clicking softly. To anyone observing, she appeared absorbed in a pattern of pale blue wool, but her eyes, as sharp as ever, missed nothing. She noticed that Mrs. Pembroke's laugh was just a fraction too loud when Mr. Alton praised her hydrangeas. She saw how young Rose Cartwright, the inspector's niece, kept glancing toward the gate, as if waiting for someone who was late, or perhaps someone she wished would not arrive at all. When Inspector Cartwright did appear, there was a visible shift among the guests. He was not a man easily ignored. Broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with an air of authority that unsettled even those with nothing to hide. He greeted the ladies politely, accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Clement, and exchanged a few words with Colonel Hargraves about the new constable posted in Much Benham. Yet beneath the civility there was an undercurrent, something taut and unsaid. Even Miss Marple felt it, like a faint tremor beneath the grass. It was only after the second round of tea had been poured that the commotion began. A tray slipped from Rose Cartwright's hands, cups crashing to the ground. She gasped, not from the noise, but from what she saw beyond the rose arch. Her uncle lay sprawled across the gravel path leading to the orchard. His hat tilted aside, his face turned toward the afternoon sky, utterly still. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, the guests had gathered in a stunned semicircle. The doctor knelt beside the body, his brows knitting tighter by the second. "He's gone," he said quietly, "but not from natural causes." A collective murmur rose. Mrs. Clement pressed a trembling hand to her throat. Colonel Hargraves muttered something about shock. Miss Marple, meanwhile, leaned forward just slightly, eyes narrowing. She had seen a great many deaths in her time, both expected and otherwise. This one was peculiar. The inspector's shoes were clean despite the garden's damp paths, and one glove was missing, only the left. A curious detail, and one no one else seemed to notice. As the police were summoned and the guests dispersed in nervous whispers, Miss Marple remained seated beneath her elm tree, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She looked toward the orchard once more, then to the guests drifting away like autumn leaves. In her quiet way, she murmured to herself, "How very strange that a man so careful should meet his end at a garden party." And somewhere in the distance, the church bells began to toll. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to an unease that no one could quite name. The sparrows still quarrelled in the hedges, the milk still clinked softly upon the doorsteps, yet a hush had fallen over the village as if the very air held its breath. The death of Inspector Cartwright had unsettled everyone, not least because he was one of their own, a man who had stood for order, law, and quiet decency. Now he was gone, and in his place remained only questions whispered through half-closed curtains. At the post office, Mrs. Hartley announced she had seen the inspector speaking with a stranger the day before. "Tall man, brown coat, didn't look the friendly sort," she told anyone who would listen. By noon, this had become a foreign gentleman with a scar, and by tea-time, the stranger had acquired a motive, a weapon, and a tendency to loiter near the vicarage. The gossip web grew fast and thick in St. Mary Mead, faster even than the ivy on the church wall. Miss Marple heard it all as she walked to the grocer's that morning. She nodded politely at the speculation, but offered none of her own. Inside her mind, thoughts arranged themselves in quiet order. She recalled the missing glove, the clean shoes, the position of the body, and, perhaps most curious of all, the faint smell that lingered when Dr. Haydock leaned over the inspector. A faint almond scent, so soft it could have been mistaken for the sweet cake served earlier. At the grocer's counter, she encountered young Rose Cartwright, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. She insisted she was helping the police, though the tremor in her hand betrayed her composure. "They think it was poison," Rose said softly, glancing about. "Uncle had a small flask of brandy in his coat. They found traces of something in it. Cyanide, they think." Miss Marple's eyes moved from the girl's trembling fingers to the loaf of bread she held too tightly. "So very quick cyanide," she said gently, and always with that dreadful almond note. "Poor child, what a shock it must have been for you." Rose swallowed, her lips pressing together. "He wasn't supposed to be at the party, you know. Aunt Clara said he'd been working on something in Much Benham. But he came back early. He said he had to speak to someone privately." Her voice faltered. "I suppose we'll never know what about." Miss Marple gave a small hum of sympathy, but her mind was already turning over that remark like a pebble in a stream. A private conversation, a sudden return from work, and a death in the middle of a cheerful afternoon. Coincidences, perhaps. But coincidences seldom thrived in St. Mary Mead without reason. By afternoon, the village square had turned into a stage for nervous conjecture. Colonel Hargraves maintained it must have been a case of mistaken identity. Mrs. Pembroke swore she'd seen the inspector quarreling with a man near the butcher's shop earlier that week. And Mrs. Clement, still pale from shock, could not stop repeating how dreadful it all was, how terribly dreadful, as if repetition might make sense of it. The constable, young Sergeant Wilkes, went about with an air of grave importance, questioning anyone who had so much as refilled a teacup during the garden party. He took notes earnestly, though it was evident from the way his eyes darted toward Miss Marple that he felt out of his depth. That evening, as dusk softened the roofs and the lamps flickered to life, Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, the faint ticking of the clock keeping time with her thoughts. Outside, the lane was empty except for a single figure. Rose again, walking swiftly toward the rectory. A moment later, another figure emerged from the shadows, the vicar himself, speaking in low tones as he met the girl at the gate. Miss Marple's needles stilled. It was curious, that meeting. Rose had always been polite but distant toward the vicar, yet now she sought him out, just hours after the inquest had been announced for tomorrow morning. She rose, moved to draw the curtains, then hesitated. Through the dimming light she caught the faintest outline of the vicar handing something small, folded paper perhaps, to the girl. Rose tucked it quickly into her coat and hurried away. Later, when Miss Marple finally turned in for the night, the unease still stirred beneath the quiet of her thoughts. The inspector's death was beginning to take shape, not yet clear, but forming in the shadows like a figure seen through mist. She could not name it yet, but she sensed deceit at its heart, delicate and deliberate. Someone had known precisely when to act and how to ensure the act appeared almost natural. Almost. The next morning, a thin drizzle fell over the village, softening the sound of footsteps on the cobbles. The inquest was held in the parish hall, a place that had hosted everything from harvest suppers to amateur theatricals. Now, its folding chairs creaked beneath an uneasy crowd. The coroner read his notes with practiced detachment, though his voice carried a trace of discomfort. Cause of death, cyanide poisoning, administered orally. No sign of struggle. Death instantaneous. Gasps rose from the audience, though not of surprise. Merely confirmation. The real interest came with the next line. A half-empty flask was recovered from the deceased's coat pocket. It contained traces of the poison, whether self-administered or otherwise remains undetermined. Rose Cartwright let out a soft cry. Mrs. Pembroke muttered, "Suicide. Impossible." Colonel Hargraves shook his head so hard his monocle fell out. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back, hands folded in her lap. She studied faces instead of words. Rose's shock seemed genuine, the vicar's discomfort greater than the situation required, and Mrs. Pembroke's outrage too quick, too bright. It was as though each person feared the truth for a different reason. When the coroner concluded with death by poisoning, cause uncertain, Miss Marple knew the village would not rest easy, and as she stepped out into the grey light, she paused, her umbrella tapping gently against the stone. People, she thought softly, rarely poison themselves in company, but someone always benefits when a death seems convenient. Somewhere down the lane, a shutter closed hastily. The rain began to fall in earnest, thin and steady, and Miss Marple, walking home alone, began to see the faint outline of a pattern, one that, like her knitting, would take time and patience to reveal. When Miss Marple returned from the inquest, the drizzle had not yet lifted. It hung in the air like a curtain of silver threads, blurring the hedgerows and dimming the thatched roofs. She walked slowly, umbrella in hand, deep in thought. The village seemed smaller somehow, tightened, drawn inward, as though every cottage held its breath behind lace curtains. She paused near the post office, where Mrs. Hartley was still retelling her story of the mysterious stranger, though with new flourishes. "He had an accent, you know," she was saying to Mr. Finch, "and a limp, foreign, no doubt, probably slipped away on the early train." Miss Marple smiled faintly and moved on. St. Mary Mead was so very efficient at building phantoms from shadows. When she reached her gate, a figure was waiting, a young constable, rain dripping from his cap. He introduced himself as Sergeant Wilkes, nervous but earnest. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple, but I've been asked to have a word with you. Superintendent Morton thought you might, have observed something at the party. Something the rest of us missed." Miss Marple invited him in, her tone as mild as if she were discussing roses. She set about making tea, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the young man fidget. Finally, she said, "One does notice things, Sergeant, when one has little else to do but observe human nature, and I did notice a few peculiarities yesterday." Wilkes leaned forward. "Such as?" She poured his tea before answering. The inspector's shoes were spotless, quite impossible considering the damp paths. Yet he'd been walking about the garden for some time. I also noticed one glove missing, and a faint scent, bitter almonds. That would seem to agree with the doctor's finding of cyanide. But the missing glove troubles me, you see. People seldom misplace only one. And if you recall, the right-hand glove was still on his person. Wilkes frowned. "You think it was planted?" "I think," she said softly, "that whoever handled the flask may have worn that glove. It would have been most inconvenient to hold a poisoned container with bare hands. And then, perhaps, it was discarded." The sergeant stared, impressed despite himself. "You believe it was murder, then?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "My dear young man, in my experience, people very rarely choose to end their lives immediately after attending a garden party." After he left, she remained seated by the fire, the rhythmic tick of the clock soothing her thoughts. She recalled Rose's words. Her uncle had come home early to speak to someone privately. That suggested planning, not despair. But who had he intended to meet? And why at such a public gathering? It was a poor setting for secrecy, unless, of course, the conversation was meant to appear accidental. That evening, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Mrs. Pembroke. The woman was known for her social reach and her tendency to collect fragments of gossip like a magpie gathers trinkets. She greeted Miss Marple with her usual bright fluster, insisting she take sherry, though her hands trembled as she poured. "Such a dreadful thing, Jane. I can hardly sleep. To think that dear Inspector Cartwright should die in my own circle." Miss Marple sipped delicately. "Yes, quite dreadful. I was wondering, dear, you were standing rather close to the orchard path when it happened, were you not?" Mrs. Pembroke blinked rapidly. Well, yes, I suppose I was, though I saw nothing useful, I assure you. Oh, except... Yes, I do recall someone calling his name just before he fell. Calling his name? A man's voice. Deep. But there were so many about, and it happened so quickly. I really couldn't say who. Miss Marple nodded, though her gaze lingered thoughtfully on Mrs. Pembroke's rings, one of which, she noticed, was new. An opal, very striking and not the sort of thing her husband would have chosen. When she returned home, she found a note pushed beneath her door. The handwriting was hurried, the paper smudged by rain. Please, Miss Marple, I must speak to you. I think I know who Uncle met that day. But it's not safe here. It was signed Rose. Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet, controlled flutter. She folded the note neatly, placed it on her writing desk, and glanced at the clock. Nearly 9. Too late to visit, but early enough to worry. She debated for a moment, then fetched her coat and lantern. The lanes were slick and silent, and her small light moved like a will-o'-the-wisp through the mist. Rose lived in a cottage near the old rectory. When Miss Marple reached it, the front door stood slightly ajar. She knocked once, twice, then stepped inside. The sitting room was dim, the fire nearly out. A cup of tea stood untouched on the table. Steam long vanished. On the floor near the hearth lay a folded piece of paper, identical to the one she had received. It read only, "He knew about the glove." Miss Marple's breath caught. There was no sign of Rose, no coat or no handbag. She moved carefully to the window and peered out. The rain had stopped, but the lane beyond was empty. Only the soft, distant echo of a car engine faded toward the main road. She turned back, studying the room. The second cup beside the untouched tea had lipstick on the rim, dark red, not Rose's usual shade. And beside it, a faint imprint on the table's edge where something metallic had rested, round and heavy. A flask, perhaps. Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and stepped outside, her mind sharper now, the quiet resolve in her bones steady as ever. Rose Cartwright had not left of her own accord, and if the inspector's death had begun in the bright civility of a garden party, it was now leading into darker places, places where politeness could no longer hide what people truly were. As she locked her gate behind her and entered the stillness of her cottage, she murmured under her breath, "It always begins with something small, a misplaced glove, a frightened girl, and ends with human nature laid bare." She placed the note beside her knitting, the pale blue yarn curling like smoke, and waited for morning. The following morning dawned pale and cold, the kind of morning when even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already returning to the events of the previous night. The note from Rose lay where she had left it, beside her knitting basket. She stared at it for a long while before folding it carefully into her pocket. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the village's silence only deepened that certainty. At 8:30, a knock sounded at her door. Sergeant Wilkes stood there, his uniform damp with mist, his expression tight. "Miss Marple, I'm afraid there's been another development," he said, his voice low. "Miss Rose Cartwright is missing. Her aunt reported it early this morning. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and no one's seen her since last night." Miss Marple did not feign surprise. "I rather thought that might be the case," she said softly. "Do come in, Sergeant. You look chilled." He followed her to the parlor, where the fire was already crackling. She poured him tea while he explained that the police were organizing a search party. "The superintendent believes she may have gone to stay with a friend in Much Benham, but—" His voice faltered as Miss Marple handed him the note. "She didn't go willingly," Miss Marple said. "This was pushed under my door sometime after dusk. She asked to meet me. When I arrived at her cottage, she was gone, but I found this." She handed him the second note, the one from the floor with the words, "He knew about the glove." Wilkes frowned as he read it. "So she knew something. something that might have put her in danger. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, and I believe it ties directly to her uncle's death. You see, Inspector Cartwright was a man of habits. He prided himself on his cleanliness, his orderliness. He would never have put a contaminated flask in his own coat pocket. Someone else did. And I suspect Rose discovered who that someone was. The young sergeant's eyes widened slightly. You think whoever killed him might have taken her? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the rain-blurred window, or frightened her enough to make her run. Fear can be a very persuasive jailer, Sergeant. By midday, the village was buzzing again, whispers at every doorstep, faces peering from behind curtains. Word of Rose's disappearance had spread faster than the Morning Post. Mrs. Pembroke declared that she had heard a motor car near the rectory quite late, though she couldn't be sure of the color or make. The vicar, when asked, claimed he had been writing sermons and heard nothing at all. Miss Marple, who knew the vicar to be honest but not always forthcoming, decided to visit him herself. She found him in his study, surrounded by neat stacks of paper and the faint smell of candle wax. His hands twitched slightly when he saw her. "Ah, Miss Marple. Dreadful business, dreadful. Poor girl, she's so young." "Yes," said Miss Marple, settling into a chair opposite him. "And devoted to her uncle, by all accounts. I wonder, did she ever confide in you?" He hesitated. "We spoke once or twice. She was troubled by his manner, I think. She said he'd become secretive lately, preoccupied." "Preoccupied with what, I wonder?" Miss Marple murmured. "You wouldn't happen to know if he kept any papers, perhaps from his work?" The vicar looked momentarily alarmed. "He did mention some notes, yes. Said he was looking into an old case that had never sat right with him. Something to do with forged accounts in the constabulary's budget, I believe. But he didn't say more." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. And would you say that anyone in the village might have had reason to wish that matter forgotten?" The vicar's mouth opened, then closed again. "I really couldn't say." His fingers trembled as he reached for his pen. "If you'll excuse me, I must prepare for the evening service." When Miss Marple left the rectory, she was certain of two things. The vicar was lying, and Rose had learned more than was safe for her to know. That afternoon, the constables found Rose's handbag in a ditch along the road to Much Benham. Inside were her identification, her house keys, and a torn scrap of paper with part of a name written on it, Pem. The rest was missing. Miss Marple stood beside the discovery, the drizzle dampening her hat. She said nothing, though Wilkes noticed her eyes narrow ever so slightly. Later, as the police fanned out along the lane, she lingered behind, studying the roadside. A patch of flattened grass led into the hedgerow, and there, half hidden in the mud, was something pale. She bent down and picked it up carefully with her handkerchief. It was a glove, left-handed, the same shade of beige the inspector had worn. "Sergeant," she called softly, "I think our missing piece has just been found." Wilkes hurried over. "The inspector's glove?" "Perhaps," she said, turning it delicately. "Or perhaps not. But whoever handled that poisoned flask used this hand. The question, Sergeant, is whose hand it truly was." That evening, as the lamps flickered to life across the village, Miss Marple sat once more in her parlor, piecing the puzzle together. Inspector Cartwright investigating corruption, a sudden, convenient death. His niece, aware of something, now missing. And the vicar, so mild, so kind, holding back a truth that burned at his conscience. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the hills, a low murmur of warning. Miss Marple folded her hands and whispered to herself, "There's a reason evil prefers quiet villages. People here are too polite to imagine it lives among them." She blew out the candle, but her mind stayed bright and alert, like a watchful light in the dark. The storm broke over St. Mary Mead before dawn, washing the streets clean of dust and rumor alike. By the time Miss Marple rose and lit her lamp, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle that blurred the garden beyond her window. She moved quietly about her cottage, methodical as ever, though her mind was far from calm. The discovery of the glove weighed heavily on her thoughts. It was a clue both plain and perplexing, a tangible object that whispered of hands unseen. At 9 o'clock, Sergeant Wilkes arrived once again, boots slick with mud and expression grim. "We've searched along the Much Benham Road," he reported, standing just inside her doorway. "But there's no trace of Miss Cartwright, only her handbag and that glove." Miss Marple gestured toward the fire. "Sit down, Sergeant. You look as though you haven't had your breakfast." She poured tea as she spoke. "Tell me, has anyone been able to account for their whereabouts last evening?" He hesitated. "Most of the villagers have, except Mrs. Pembroke. She claims she was unwell and went to bed early, but her maid says she heard the motor car leave around 9:30. Miss Marple's hands did not pause as she stirred the sugar into his cup. "Ah," she murmured, "that would be about the time I found Miss Cartwright's cottage empty. And Mrs. Pembroke, does she drive herself?" "No, ma'am. Her chauffeur does, though he insists he was home all night. Says the car never left the garage." "How loyal of him," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps too loyal." When Wilkes had gone, she sat for a long while, fingers resting lightly on her teacup. Mrs. Pembroke had always been an ambitious woman, socially climbing, extravagantly dressed, and quietly dissatisfied with her marriage. Her husband, dull but wealthy, had business ties in Much Benham, ties that Inspector Cartwright might have found suspicious, especially if the rumors of forged accounts were true. And now Rose's note. He knew about the glove. It pointed toward a connection. Later that morning, Miss Marple took her customary walk to the green. The village was restless, the way small places always became when fear took root. At the post office, 2 women lowered their voices as she passed. At the grocer's, conversation stopped altogether. She greeted them all pleasantly, pausing only when she saw Colonel Hargrave standing by the lane, puffing at his pipe with unnecessary vigor. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, trying for casualness. "Nasty business, this. Can't imagine what's come over our village. First the inspector, now the girl. Makes one almost afraid to open the paper." "Quite so," she agreed. "And yet one must wonder, Colonel, whether the 2 misfortunes are connected. Do you recall seeing Mrs. Pembroke at the party that afternoon?" The Colonel frowned. "Pembroke? Yes, dressed in lavender, wasn't she? Always has a look about her as though she expects the vicar to bow. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I merely wondered whether she appeared at ease. One learns a great deal from how people hold their cups." The Colonel chuckled uncertainly, but Miss Marple's eyes remained sharp. She had noticed that lavender dress too, noticed, in fact, the faint smear on the sleeve when Mrs. Pembroke had stooped to pick up Rose's broken teacups. It had looked like pollen then, a harmless yellow dust from the flowers. But the inspector's flask, now sealed in the police evidence room, had borne a similar yellow trace around the neck. A careless detail, and most people never considered how easily color betrays touch. That afternoon, she visited Dr. Haydock under the pretext of inquiring after his rheumatism. Over tea, she asked, quite casually, "You examined the inspector's belongings, didn't you, Doctor? I wonder, did you notice anything unusual about the residue in the flask?" He looked puzzled. "Unusual? Only the expected compound of cyanide. But now that you mention it, the powder adhering to the stopper was tinted faintly yellow. I assumed it was a stabilizing agent. Quite common." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, quite common in theory, but perhaps less so in practice. You see, Doctor, there's a variety of glove powder used by certain ladies. Those who dislike the smell of leather. It leaves a faint yellow stain. I dare say if one handled a flask dusted with such powder, it might transfer easily." Dr. Haydock stared. You're implying—" "I imply nothing," she said gently. "I merely observe." As she walked home through the lengthening twilight, the puzzle began to take shape with terrible clarity. The missing glove, the yellow trace, the anxious vicar, and Mrs. Pembroke's unexplained outing, all threads now weaving toward a single point. But one question still gnawed at her. What had Rose discovered that night? Near her gate, she found an envelope pinned beneath her door knocker. The handwriting was the same, hurried scrawl as before. "Don't trust anyone. Not even him. Meet me at the old mill at dusk tomorrow." The signature was missing, but she knew at once who had written it. Rose was alive. Miss Marple stood in the fading light, the wind tugging gently at her scarf. Relief came first, followed swiftly by concern. If the girl was still alive, she was in grave danger, and whoever had poisoned the inspector would not hesitate to silence her, too. Inside, she locked the door and drew the curtains. The village might have settled into its evening calm, but she knew that somewhere among its peaceful cottages and trimmed hedgerows, someone was waiting. Someone who had already killed once and was prepared to kill again. Miss Marple set the letter beside her lamp and whispered into the quiet, "Tomorrow, then. We shall see who keeps the appointment." The following day unfolded under a low, oppressive sky, the kind that pressed down upon the village and dulled every sound. Even the church bell seemed reluctant to chime. Miss Marple spent the morning pretending at her ordinary routines, watering the geraniums, returning a borrowed book to Mrs. Price Ridley, but her thoughts never strayed far from the letter pinned to her door. "Meet me at the old mill at dusk." She had not told Sergeant Wilkes. There were moments when official interference only frightened secrets back into the shadows, and Miss Marple had long learned that fear was the enemy of truth. As the afternoon deepened into a misty twilight, she prepared to go. She wore her plain grey coat and a small hat pinned firmly against the wind. In her handbag she carried a torch, a whistle, and something rather less usual, a small flask filled not with sherry, but with water tinted to resemble it. "It is never unwise," she murmured to herself, "to be thought weaker than one is." The path to the old mill wound through meadows still damp from last night's storm. She walked slowly, her shoes sinking softly into the earth, and paused once to listen. Somewhere to her left, a twig snapped. She turned, but saw only mist curling through the hedgerow. When she reached the mill at last, the building stood as she remembered, its roof sagging, the wheel long still, the air thick with the smell of moss and water. "Rose?" she called gently. Her voice seemed to vanish into the fog. She stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, and the only light came from the slit of moon struggling through the broken window panes. On a beam above the doorway, a small lantern flickered, a sign perhaps that someone had been there recently. Then she heard it, a faint rustle, a stifled sob. Miss Marple turned her torch toward the sound, and the beam caught a figure crouched near the far wall. "Rose!" she exclaimed softly. The girl turned, eyes wide and frightened. Her clothes were damp, her hair tangled, and her face pale with exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she whispered, clutching her shawl. "I didn't know where else to go. I thought they were following me." "Who, my dear?" Rose hesitated. "Mrs. Pembroke and the vicar. They both came to see Uncle the day before he died. I heard them arguing, something about a file he kept from his old investigations. Uncle said he had proof someone in the village had embezzled police funds. Mrs. Pembroke told him to destroy it, but he refused. He said he'd already sent part of it to Scotland Yard." She stopped, trembling. "That night, she came to our house. She said she wanted to make peace, brought a small bottle of brandy as a gift. Uncle never suspected her." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes darkened with understanding. "And the glove?" she asked softly. "She wore them when she poured his drink," Rose said. "Soft leather, scented. But when she left, one was missing, I found it under the table the next morning, stained yellow from the powder. I meant to bring it to the police, but then she came back. She said she knew what I'd found. I ran. I've been hiding since." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the vicar? He knew about the money. He said if the truth came out, the church's reputation would suffer. He tried to persuade her to keep quiet, but I think she used that against him." A sound outside made them both freeze, the crunch of gravel, deliberate and slow. Rose's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple turned off the torch and motioned her toward the shadows behind the beam. The footsteps came closer, stopping just beyond the doorway. A moment of silence, then a soft creak as the door pushed open. Mrs. Pembroke stepped inside. She was dressed elegantly as always, though her eyes were sharper now, her beauty hollowed by tension. "Miss Cartwright," she said, her voice calm and cutting, "I thought you'd have the sense to stay hidden. And Miss Marple, how very inconvenient to find you here." "I might say the same, dear," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "though it does seem an odd place for a social call." Mrs. Pembroke's lips curved faintly. "You've always underestimated me. Everyone has. I suppose that's what makes people like you dangerous. You notice the details no one else bothers with. But it's far too late now." She reached into her coat pocket, and for a heartbeat, Miss Marple feared the glint of metal. But instead, she withdrew a small vial, its contents amber and faintly luminous in the moonlight. "I only wanted to protect my husband," she said. "Cartwright would have ruined us all, and the vicar, well, he's weak. He'll tell whatever story I choose." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "But you see, Mrs. Pembroke, stories have a way of rewriting themselves when one knows the truth. For instance, the chauffeur. He's already spoken to Sergeant Wilkes. The car did leave that night, and he saw you drive it yourself. You wore gloves then, too, didn't you? Yellow powder on the steering wheel, matching that found on the inspector's flask." For the first time, Mrs. Pembroke's composure cracked. "You can't prove it," she hissed. Miss Marple smiled mildly. "My dear, proof is a matter of patience. The police will find the matching gloves soon enough. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to lead them to it yourself." The woman's hand trembled. The vial slipped from her grasp and shattered on the stone floor. The sharp scent of almonds filled the air. In the same instant, footsteps thundered outside, the sergeant's voice calling, "Mrs. Pembroke, Miss Marple." Rose let out a sob of relief as Wilkes appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 constables. Mrs. Pembroke sank against the beam, defeated, her eyes closing as if the fight had finally left her. Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on Rose's shoulder. "There, my dear," she whispered. "It's over now. Evil seldom triumphs in villages like ours. It only hides, waiting for someone polite enough to look it in the eye." Outside, the rain began again, soft and unending, washing the last traces of poison into the earth. And as the lantern light flickered across the mill's damp walls, Miss Marple turned once more toward home, her steps quiet, her thoughts as calm and certain as the ticking of her old clock. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was alive again with quiet astonishment. The arrest of Mrs. Pembroke had spread through the village before breakfast, finding its way into every teacup and every whispered conversation along the high street. Some spoke of her madness, others of greed, but most simply marveled that such wickedness had bloomed in the midst of their well-trimmed hedges. Yet for Miss Marple, the matter did not yet sit easily. There was a weight in her chest, a faint unease that told her something had not quite settled into place. Sergeant Wilkes called upon her just before 10, looking both relieved and uncertain. "She confessed, Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap. "Mrs. Pembroke admitted to poisoning the inspector and trying to frighten the girl. Said she panicked after the quarrel, that she only meant to silence him, not kill him." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Panicked, did she? A curious word, Sergeant. Panic seldom leaves room for careful preparation, and yet she brought the poison, waited until a public gathering, and ensured her husband was away. No, that was not panic. It was precision. Wilkes frowned. You think there's more to it? I think, she said softly, that Mrs. Pembroke is clever, but not quite clever enough to orchestrate everything alone. He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. The vicar's been asking to see you. Says he's feeling rather unwell about it all. Perhaps you'd talk to him? Miss Marple nodded. I will. Guilt, like infection, spreads quickly when the conscience is tender. The vicar's house was still and cold when she arrived. The curtains were half drawn, and the fire burned low. He looked older than he had 2 days before, his complexion pale and his eyes shadowed. He gestured weakly for her to sit. It's all too dreadful, Miss Marple, he said, wringing his hands. To think I ever knew such a woman, such evil beneath such composure. I should have warned the inspector. I should have told him about the money. Miss Marple interrupted gently. He froze. I beg your pardon? She smiled faintly. My dear Reverend, you are not a practiced liar. You hide your guilt behind your prayers, but it still peeks through every tremor of your voice. You knew about the corruption before the inspector did. He trusted you, I imagine, shared his suspicions, perhaps even the evidence itself. The vicar's lips parted, then closed again. You don't understand, he whispered. It wasn't my secret to tell. The inspector came to me weeks ago. He'd discovered discrepancies in the parish fund, donations diverted, invoices forged. He believed it led to Mrs. Pembroke's husband. I begged him to leave it alone. We couldn't afford a scandal, but he wouldn't listen. He said justice mattered more than reputation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And then Mrs. Pembroke learned of his intentions. He covered his face with his hands. She came to me that night, said she'd make it all disappear. I thought she meant the evidence, not the man. His voice broke. And when I realized what she'd done, I told myself I could bear the silence for the sake of peace. But it has eaten at me ever since. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet compassion. It is not peace you preserved, Reverend. Only delay. Evil does not end when one turns away. It simply waits for the next chance to speak. He looked up, tears in his eyes. What will become of me? That, I think, depends on your honesty when the police return. It is seldom too late to tell the truth, though one must do it before truth tells itself. When she left the rectory, the air had grown sharper. The mist was lifting, and through the thinning clouds the church spire shone pale against the sky. She walked home slowly, her thoughts heavy with what she had heard. Mrs. Pembroke's confession would satisfy the police, of course. It was neat, it was believable. But Miss Marple knew the story was not complete until every motive, every cowardice had been named. The vicar had not poisoned anyone, but his silence had made room for murder. That evening, Sergeant Wilkes called again. You were right, Miss Marple, he said, setting his cap on her table. We searched the Pembroke house this afternoon. Found a second set of ledgers in a locked drawer, one kept by the husband, not the wife. It seems he was taking money from parish repairs and using it to cover debts from his business. The inspector must have been close to exposing him. The wife acted to protect them both. Protect, Miss Marple repeated softly. Such a dangerous word, Sergeant. So many crimes are committed in its name. He gave a weary smile. I don't suppose we'll ever have a village quite as quiet again. Miss Marple looked toward the window where the last of the daylight faded. Oh, I imagine we shall. Human nature does not change. Only the faces that wear it. St. Mary Mead will gossip for a week, bake a few extra cakes for the constable, and then the garden parties will begin again. Just as before. But somewhere, beneath the roses and the lace curtains, another little seed will be taking root. It always does. Wilkes shook his head with a half-smile, not sure whether she meant to comfort or warn him. When he left, Miss Marple sat a while longer in the glow of the fire. Outside, The rain had stopped at last, and the night was very still. On her table lay the blue wool she had been knitting at the garden party, the same thread that had stilled in her lap when Inspector Cartwright fell. She picked it up now, looping the yarn between her fingers, her eyes soft but alert. "One stitch dropped," she murmured, tightening it with care. "One truth untold, it is always the small things that unravel the whole." And with that, she resumed her quiet knitting, the sound of the needles mingling with the faint ticking of the clock, a rhythm as steady as justice itself and as unhurried as Miss Marple's patient understanding of human hearts. The days that followed brought a strange stillness to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The Pembroke affair had concluded, at least in the eyes of the police, but for Miss Marple, the air remained thick with unfinished truths. People nodded briskly in the lanes, spoke in lowered voices at the post office, and hurried home before dusk, uneasy beneath the surface, calm. Even the sparrows seemed quieter, as if reluctant to disturb the delicate veil that now hung over everything. Miss Marple went about her daily errands with her usual composure, though she could not shake the faint feeling that something remained unspoken, something that had slipped past them all, too quiet to draw attention but too deliberate to ignore. The glove had been found, the poison accounted for, the confession recorded, and yet the balance of things did not quite ring true. Evil, in her experience, seldom presented itself neatly tied. One afternoon, as she passed the churchyard, she found Reverend Clay standing near the gate, his face drawn and his manner subdued. He removed his hat when he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wish to thank you. The constable told me you spoke kindly of me to the superintendent. He's decided not to press charges." She inclined her head. "It was the only proper outcome, Reverend. You were guilty of silence, not of deceit, though both have consequences." He sighed, looking toward the graves. "I thought I was preserving peace. Instead, I allowed wickedness to flourish under my nose. I see now that cowardice can look very much like virtue, if one squints at it long enough." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "Human nature is a creature of excuses. We build them, live among them, and only when the walls fall do we call them lies." She adjusted her gloves. "Tell me, Reverend, has Mr. Pembroke returned from London?" He looked startled. "You didn't hear? He collapsed yesterday morning. Heart failure, they said. The shock of it all, I suppose." Her brows lifted ever so slightly. Indeed, sudden collapses do seem to travel in pairs. That evening, as dusk crept over the village, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, going over the events once more in her mind. There was something about the timing, Mrs. Pembroke's confession, the vicar's sudden relief, and now the husband's death, that formed a pattern she could almost see but not yet name. She rose and fetched her shawl, deciding on a brief walk to clear her thoughts. The air outside was crisp, touched with the scent of rain on leaves. She turned toward the Pembroke residence, where the windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. A black draped wreath already hung on the gatepost, a sign that the household had embraced mourning with its usual efficiency. She noticed a figure standing by the side door, speaking in low tones to the maid. It was Dr. Haydock. He looked up as Miss Marple approached. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, his expression tired. "Sad business, this. The man never stood a chance. Dropped in his study, stone dead before I arrived." "I see," she replied softly. "And the cause?" He hesitated. "I can't be sure without the coroner's word, but it looked natural enough. No struggle, no sign of distress. His tea was half finished beside him." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the doctor's face. "Tea, you say?" "Yes. Perfectly ordinary, though—" He paused, frowning slightly. "There was a peculiar smell in the room, not strong, but faintly metallic. I thought it might be the polish on the desk." "Or perhaps," she murmured, "the faintest echo of almonds." Dr. Haydock's eyes sharpened. "You don't mean—" I mean only that misfortune rarely travels alone, Doctor. Mrs. Pembroke had reason enough to kill once. Her husband may have had reason to fear her confession. The doctor exhaled heavily. You think she wasn't acting alone? Miss Marple looked back toward the dark windows. No, I think she was acting on behalf of someone clever enough to let her believe she was saving them both. The next morning brought confirmation of her unease. Sergeant Wilkes appeared again, looking both harried and bewildered. You'll never believe it, Miss Marple, he said as soon as she opened the door. Mr. Pembroke's will has just been examined. He left everything to the vicarage fund. Every penny. Miss Marple blinked once, slowly. To the church? How very generous of him, considering he and the Reverend had barely spoken in years. Exactly what I said, Wilkes replied. The vicar claims he didn't know a thing about it, but I've seen that signature. It was witnessed 2 weeks ago, right around the time the inspector reopened his investigation. Miss Marple sat very still, her teacup untouched. 2 weeks, she murmured, and the vicar, so eager to keep the parish unblemished, suddenly finds himself absolved of all blame and beneficiary to a fortune that erases his debt of guilt. Wilkes frowned. You think the vicar forged it? I think, Sergeant, she said gently, that there is more than one way to commit murder. Some kill with poison, others with persuasion. The Reverend Clay strikes me as a man who discovered, too late, how very powerful repentance can be, especially when it comes written in someone else's hand. Wilkes stared at her, then gave a short, uneasy laugh. You make it sound as if the whole village is a crime waiting to happen. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear boy, every village is. People in cities may sin in crowds, but in small places they sin in whispers, and that is far more dangerous. When he left, the quiet of her cottage seemed deeper than before. She looked toward the window, where the first light of morning touched the garden with silver. It was over now, she supposed, though the taste of unease still lingered. The Pembrokes were gone, the vicar ruined by his own conscience, and poor Rose, safe now, but changed forever. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, her fingers deft and calm. Outside, the church bell tolled a slow, solemn note that drifted through the village like a sigh. Evil, she whispered, her eyes distant, never vanishes. It merely waits for the next kind face to borrow. And as the sound faded into the hush of the morning, she resumed her knitting, thread slipping quietly through her fingers, binding the loose ends of the story with the same patience she gave to life itself, one stitch at a time, until all was tidy once more. 2 evenings later, the air in St. Mary Mead grew heavy once again, not with gossip this time, but with that uneasy silence that comes when people sense an ending they cannot name. The Pembroke house remained shuttered, its windows black, its drive slick with rain that glistened faintly under the lamplight. Miss Marple, however, could not rest. There were loose threads still, tiny, untidy threads she could neither ignore nor tie away. She had learned, through long experience, that evil often left its mark not in what was done, but in what was left unfinished. After supper, she sat before her fire, eyes half closed, the knitting untouched in her lap. Her mind went back over the smallest details. The garden party. The inspector's clean shoes, the missing glove, Rose's trembling hand, Mrs. Pembroke's confession that had arrived almost too neatly, and the vicar's trembling righteousness. The pattern, at last, began to emerge. Not a single act of wickedness, but a chain, each link forged by fear and self-interest. It had begun with greed, but it had ended, as such things often did, in quiet hypocrisy. A knock sounded at her door just as the clock struck 9. When she opened it, Rose stood there, pale but determined, her coat soaked from the drizzle. "I had to see you, Miss Marple," she said quickly. "I couldn't leave it as it is. They say it's all over, but I know it isn't." Miss Marple guided her inside, helped her out of her wet coat, and poured her a cup of tea. "Sit down, my dear," she said kindly. "Tell me what troubles you." Rose's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cup. "It's about the vicar. I went to see him yesterday. I wanted to thank him for speaking to the police on my behalf. He seemed strange, nervous. He asked if I had spoken to you about my uncle's papers. When I told him they'd been sent to Scotland Yard, he looked as if I'd struck him." Miss Marple listened without interrupting. "And then," Rose continued, "he said something peculiar. He told me that sometimes the living must carry the sins of the dead, that it's the only way to preserve peace. I didn't understand him at first, but then he said, 'Your uncle's death served a purpose. Let it rest there.'" She set her cup down, her voice shaking. "It didn't sound like grief, Miss Marple. It sounded like warning." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. "Quite right, my dear," she said softly. "That is not the language of comfort. It is the language of concealment." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain tapping faintly at the window. Then Miss Marple rose, took her shawl from the peg, and said simply, "Fetch your coat, Rose. We shall take a walk." The church stood empty when they arrived, its nave dimly lit by 2 flickering candles. The faint scent of candle wax and damp stone hung in the air. From the vestry beyond came a faint sound, a drawer opening, then closing. Miss Marple placed a finger to her lips and led Rose quietly forward. Through the half-open door, they saw Reverend Clay bent over his desk. Papers were scattered before him, old ledgers, correspondence, and at the very top, an envelope marked Scotland Yard. Evidence. He held a match in one trembling hand. The first corner of the paper caught flame. "Reverend," Miss Marple said softly from the doorway, "surely that is not a sermon you're revising." The vicar startled, the flame flickering dangerously before he snuffed it out. His voice was hoarse. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple. Nor should you at this hour," she replied evenly. "Destroying the inspector's evidence, I presume that would be a dreadful breach of confidence." He slumped into the chair, covering his face. "You don't understand," he murmured. "It was never meant to end this way. Pembroke came to me before his wife was arrested. He begged me to protect the parish, said he'd sign everything over to the church if I helped him conceal the records. I agreed to take them, but when he realized his wife might confess, he panicked. He said he'd expose me if she was tried, so I—" He hesitated, looking at the half-burned match. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "So you brewed him tea, and added what little poison she had left." He looked up, eyes filled with a kind of desperate surrender. I couldn't let him speak. The shame would have ruined everything. She had already confessed. Her death would close the matter, and no one would ever know. "But you underestimated her," Miss Marple said softly. "And you underestimated me. You see, I suspected the pattern was incomplete. Evil seldom ends at one death. It multiplies to cover its tracks." He laughed then, a hollow, broken sound. "You'll tell them, of course." "I shall tell Sergeant Wilkes in the morning," she replied. "You have until then to write the truth properly, Reverend. I believe confession, this time sincere, might yet save your soul." The vicar bowed his head, shoulders shaking as she turned to leave. Rose followed her out, pale and silent, and when they stepped back into the rain, the bells tolled midnight. They walked home through the sleeping village, lamps glowing faintly in cottage windows. After a time, Rose spoke. "Do you think he'll do it? Write the truth?" Miss Marple's expression was calm, though her eyes were sad. "I think he already has, my dear. It is written on his conscience, and that is not a surface easily erased." When they reached the gate of Miss Marple's cottage, the air was still, the storm passed. The garden glistened faintly under the moonlight. She paused, looking back toward the church spire that rose above the village, black against the clouds. "It's an old story," she said softly. Greed begins it, fear carries it, and guilt ends it. But it always begins in small places, with quiet people who believe they are doing good. Rose looked at her with admiration and sadness. You always see what no one else does, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only because I look where others are too polite to stare. Good night, my dear. As the girl walked away, Miss Marple entered her cottage, drew the curtains, and set her kettle to boil. The firelight flickered warmly across her knitting chair. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept once more, unaware that justice, in its quiet and unhurried way, had visited it again. She sank into her chair, the needles clicking softly in her hands as the first light of dawn crept over the village roofs. And though she never spoke of it afterward, each time the church bell tolled, Miss Marple would pause in her knitting, listening, not for sorrow, but for truth, which, like her tea, was always best when left to steep in silence. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the village washed clean and unnervingly bright. The sunlight caught on the wet cobblestones, glimmering as though nothing dark had ever touched them. Yet beneath that brightness, Miss Marple sensed a kind of hollow quiet, the sort that follows confession when the truth has been spoken but not yet fully believed. She sat at her breakfast table, the teapot steaming gently, her newspaper folded beside her. The headline read simply, Vicar found dead in study. Apparent suicide in St. Mary Mead. She had expected it, though the sight of the words still carried a soft ache. The police, she knew, would take his letter as final proof of remorse. He had written of guilt, of failing his parish, of allowing evil to grow where goodness should have ruled. But Miss Marple had seen the letter before Sergeant Wilkes had taken it, had seen, in the faint tremor of the handwriting and the too deliberate phrasing, the truth beneath it. It was not a confession born of peace, but of exhaustion, and yet it was enough to close the matter for those who preferred their tragedies neatly contained. Wilkes came by just after 10, his face drawn with fatigue. He removed his cap as he stepped into her parlor. You were right again, Miss Marple, he said quietly. The vicar's gone, left a note confessing to poisoning Mr. Pembroke. Said he couldn't live with it any longer. The coroner's satisfied it was suicide. Cyanide again, from the same bottle used before. There'll be no further inquiry. She poured him tea without speaking. Only when the silence stretched did she say, It is a curious thing, Sergeant, how sin has a way of using the same instruments twice. One would think even evil might grow weary of repetition. Wilkes looked up, puzzled. You don't think he— Oh, I think he was guilty, she interrupted softly, but not entirely of his own accord. Guilt can be guided, Sergeant, much as a hand can be guided to hold a pen or to pour a final cup. He frowned. You mean someone helped him? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Help is such an imprecise word. Let us say he was encouraged to see the wisdom of ending matters quietly. Whoever placed that bottle within reach knew precisely what he would do with it. A man who has already confessed in spirit seldom needs much persuasion in deed. Wilkes hesitated, his brow furrowing. But who could have done it? Mrs. Pembroke's in prison. The servants have all been questioned. Servants, Miss Marple repeated, stirring her tea slowly. Ah, yes. But there was one we've all forgotten. The quiet sort, the kind who opens doors and vanishes before you have noticed her face. She rose, walked to her writing desk, and drew out a small, folded scrap of paper. You recall this, she said, handing it to him. It was the envelope that had once held the inspector's records, the one the vicar had tried to burn. I found this on his desk last night after you'd left. The handwriting that sealed it wasn't his. Look closely. Wilkes squinted, tracing the loops of ink. This isn't his script. Too firm. Precisely. And yet it's a hand I've seen before, on the Pembroke household accounts. Mrs. Pembroke never managed her books. Her maid did. A girl named Ellen. Came from Much Benham, worked for them 3 years. She disappeared after the arrest, didn't she? Wilkes blinked, realization dawning. She said she'd gone to stay with an aunt. Miss Marple nodded. So everyone assumed, but there was no aunt. I made inquiries, and I rather think, Sergeant, that Ellen did not serve only one master. She served both, the Pembrokes and the Reverend. She knew their secrets, carried their letters, perhaps even mixed their tea. Wilkes stood, the weight of the revelation settling on him. You believe she gave him the poison? I believe she was paid to make certain the vicar's repentance did not last long enough to cause inconvenience, Miss Marple replied. After all, Mrs. Pembroke's confession was quite dramatic, but a living accomplice with a conscience could ruin everything. A tidy ending required one more death, and Ellen, being invisible as such girls often are, would have found the task both simple and well rewarded. He ran a hand through his hair. Good Lord, and where is she now? Gone, Miss Marple said softly. I expect she's already on a train under another name. Such people do not linger. They have no attachment except to money, and money, as we know, travels swiftly. The sergeant exhaled slowly, shaking his head. We'll circulate her description. You may, she said gently, though I doubt it will matter. She will vanish into another household soon enough, serving another cup of tea with the same steady hand. He left not long after, his boots echoing softly against the wet path. When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her chair and sat for a long time in the hush of her little parlor. The clock ticked. The kettle whistled softly on the stove. She poured herself another cup and stared into the rising steam. It was not satisfaction, she felt, but a weary understanding. Evil was never grand, never theatrical. It wore aprons, spoke politely, and disappeared before anyone noticed the door had opened. The inspector's death, the Pembroke's deceit, the vicar's guilt, they were all threads in the same fabric, woven by quiet hands that moved unseen. Outside, the church bell tolled once more, deep and resonant. Miss Marple listened, the faintest sigh escaping her. Justice, she murmured, is never perfect in this world. It only ever reaches as far as human decency will allow, and that, alas, is never quite far enough. She set her cup down and reached for her knitting, her fingers steady and calm once more. Through the window, sunlight broke over the thatched roofs, gilding the village in deceptive peace, and as the needles clicked in their gentle rhythm, Miss Marple thought not of death, nor guilt, nor evil, but of the small, unending task of observation. Watching, waiting, understanding. For in St. Mary Mead, as in all the quiet corners of England, life would go on, polite, gentle, and ever so slightly cruel beneath the surface. And Miss Marple, with her calm eyes and patient smile, would be there still to see what others preferred not to notice, and to remind them, softly and without judgment, that even the smallest hands could shape the gravest sins. That night, long after the lamps had dimmed in every window across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat awake by the fire, her mind quietly circling the loose thread that refused to lie still. Ellen, the missing maid, the unseen hand in all of it. It was strange, she thought, how the smallest presence could pass through a household unnoticed and yet hold the weight of every secret it kept. The police would search, of course, but Miss Marple doubted they would find her. Ellen had the look of someone who understood when to vanish, and, more importantly, when not to leave footprints. The following morning, the air was crisp, with the kind of cold that made the world appear sharper, cleaner than it truly was. Miss Marple took her walk as usual, her cane tapping softly against the stones. Near the village green, she passed Mrs. Hartley, who was already recounting the vicar's death in tragic tones to anyone who would listen. Such a shock, Jane, and now they say that dreadful maid ran off with the vicar's savings. Terrible, simply terrible. Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but her thoughts quickened. Savings? She asked. Oh, yes, Mrs. Hartley replied, delighted to have the latest word. Apparently his bank book's missing. The sergeant said it might have gone when she cleared away his papers. Some think he gave it to her in pity. Others say she took it herself. I dare say the truth is somewhere in between. Miss Marple murmured her agreement, but as she walked on, the puzzle grew clearer. Ellen had not merely disappeared, she had taken the vicar's remaining leverage, the evidence he'd collected, perhaps even the funds he meant to use for restitution. It was a clever trick. Remove both the man and the proof, and leave behind a confession neat enough to close every file. When she reached the edge of the green, she saw Rose approaching from the direction of the post office, her face pale but resolute. Miss Marple, she called softly, I've had a letter. They stepped aside from the path, and Rose handed her the envelope. It was creased, the writing familiar, neat, deliberate loops formed by steady hand. Inside was a single line. Do not grieve for what cannot be undone. The rest will follow, as it always does. E. Miss Marple read it twice before folding it neatly. When did this arrive? This morning. No return address, but the stamps from London. London, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. The perfect place to disappear. It swallows the guilty and the frightened in equal measure. She tapped the letter gently against her fingers. And this is not a farewell. It is a promise. She means to tie off her ends before someone else does. Rose's eyes widened. Do you think she'll harm someone else? Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, my dear. Ellen is not a creature of violence. She prefers convenience. But there's one more thread left for her to pull. The money Mr. Pembroke siphoned before his death. If I'm right, she knows where it is. That afternoon, Miss Marple took the bus to Much Benham, ostensibly to visit her cousin, but her true destination was the Pembroke estate office, now locked and silent under police seal. She had a quiet word with the constable at the door, a man she'd once helped in a matter involving forged checks and a widow's misplaced ring. With a polite nod, he let her through. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old ledgers and her damp wood. Dust coated the files, though the desk itself had been disturbed recently. Papers shifted, drawers left half open as if someone had searched in haste. Miss Marple examined them with a gloved hand. Beneath a stack of invoices, she found a small, torn scrap of fabric, fine linen embroidered with an initial. E. She smiled faintly. Even ghosts, it seems, leave laundry behind. Her eyes moved toward the bookshelf where a single volume stood out, newer than the rest, the Book of Common Prayer. She lifted it and found the spine hollowed out. Inside lay a bank book and a folded letter in the vicar's hand, dated 2 days before his death. To whom it may concern, it began, if anything should happen to me, the funds transferred from the Pembroke account will be found under the church trust. I have no part in their misappropriation, but I fear my silence has cost me dearly. I pray that God may forgive those who cannot forgive themselves. Miss Marple's hand tightened around the letter. The vicar had been trying to put things right. Ellen, finding this after his death, had taken what remained, not for greed, but to keep the secret profitable. She had tied every loose thread except for one, her belief that no one in the village would ever follow her beyond its boundaries. When Miss Marple returned home that evening, the sun had already slipped behind the hills, painting the sky in long strokes of lavender and gold. She sat once more by the fire, reading over the letter, the faintest trace of melancholy softening her expression. She had no taste for justice that arrived too late, but neither did she believe in chasing shadows. Ellen would be caught one day, not by the police, but by her own certainty. The world always had a way of catching up with those who mistook cleverness for wisdom. A knock came just before she rose to retire. It was Sergeant Wilkes again, hat in hand, looking both apologetic and amused. "We had a telegram from London," he said. "Thought you'd like to know. A woman matching Ellen's description tried to withdraw funds under the vicar's name. She's been detained at the station." Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, knowing curve of the lips. "Ah," she said softly. "How very punctual of her." Wilkes shook his head. "You really do see everything, don't you?" "Oh, not everything," she replied. "Only what people try to hide. That's usually where the truth lives." When he'd gone, she sat again in her chair, listening to the faint wind rustling the garden outside. The case, at last, was finished. Justice, slow, imperfect, but real, had found its way back to St. Mary Mead. The world would turn quietly again, as it always did, until the next ripple disturbed its calm. She poured herself a final cup of tea and let the warmth steady her hands. Outside, the stars had begun to appear, small, patient lights scattered across the dark. And as she watched them, Miss Marple thought with a small, inward smile that even in the darkest corners, there was always something watching back, something that never quite let wickedness rest for long. The morning after Ellen's arrest, St. Mary Mead woke to an almost unsettling peace. The church bell rang as it always did. The milkman whistled down the lane, and Mrs. Hartley had already begun spreading her version of events, most of which bore little resemblance to the truth. But within that harmless noise of everyday life, Miss Marple felt the hush of something concluding, the faint silence that follows justice when it has done its quiet work. She sat by her window, a shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders, gazing out at the garden where dew glimmered on the roses. On the table beside her lay a fresh newspaper with the headline, "Arrest in Clergyman Case. St. Mary Mead Maid Confesses." The article was brisk, factual, and entirely devoid of the undercurrents that had run beneath the affair. It spoke of greed and conspiracy, of a servant's betrayal, and the tragic deaths of her employers. It did not, of course, speak of guilt born from fear, nor of conscience twisted into silence. Those things, Miss Marple reflected, were beyond the reach of ink. Sergeant Wilkes arrived mid-morning, his expression caught somewhere between relief and wonder. "It's all wrapped up now, Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap as he stepped inside. "Ellen's talking freely. Said she helped Mrs. Pembroke slip the poison to the inspector. Claimed she didn't know it was deadly until after the fact, though I dare say that's only half true. When the vicar started hinting at a confession, she says Mrs. Pembroke sent her a message from prison to make sure he wouldn't live long enough to talk. Promised her a share of the hidden money if she did the job properly." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And when Mrs. Pembroke died, as she was bound to do eventually, Ellen found herself in possession of both the promise and the profit. But she forgot something rather vital. Criminals seldom retire comfortably. They mistake the end of one deceit for the end of consequence." Wilkes chuckled softly, though there was admiration in his tone. "She almost got away with it. Would have done too if you hadn't noticed that bit of embroidery in the Pembroke office. How on earth did you guess?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "People who live by deceit often leave their true selves stitched into the corners. The Pembroke's maid was careful, but she had vanity. She embroidered her initials on her underclothes, a habit I've seen among women who have too little in life to claim as their own. When I found that scrap, I knew she'd been there after the vicar's death. The rest was merely deduction." He smiled, shaking his head. "I'll never understand how you manage it, Miss Marple." "Oh, it's quite simple, really," she said gently. "One must only listen, to silences as much as to words. The truth has a way of whispering, Sergeant. Most people are too busy talking to hear it." He laughed softly, then grew thoughtful. "Strange thing, though. For all the evil in it, this case feels more sad than wicked. Every one of them seemed to think they were doing what they must." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet, "and that is the oldest story in the world. Sin rarely arrives with horns and a tail, Sergeant. It comes dressed in necessity, in justification, in polite manners and reasonable excuses. It begins with something small, a missing shilling, a lie told to spare a feeling, and before long, it's quite impossible to remember where decency was lost. Wilkes nodded solemnly, and after a few moments of companionable silence, he rose to leave. Well, that's the end of it, I suppose. The papers will call you a miracle worker again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Hardly a miracle, my dear. Merely the consequence of paying attention. When he had gone, she sat for a while longer, watching the village stir to its ordinary rhythms. Rose passed by her gate, arm in arm with Dr. Haydock's new assistant, her laughter soft and uncertain, but real. Life, Miss Marple thought, always found its way back through the cracks left by tragedy. It did not forget, it simply resumed, carrying memory like a seed in the soil. As she turned back to her knitting, she allowed herself one final reflection. The inspector, Mrs. Pembroke, the vicar, even poor Ellen, all had played their parts in a morality far older than law could govern. Greed had sparked it, pride had sustained it, and fear had finished it. And she, as always, had merely been there to observe the pattern and name it aloud. That, she thought, was the true task of those who lived quietly, to see clearly where others preferred the comfort of blindness. Outside, the sunlight grew stronger, pushing through the last veils of mist. The church bell tolled once, calm and distant, not in mourning now, but in rhythm with life's return. Miss Marple lifted her head and listened until the final note faded into the stillness. Then, with a small, contented sigh, she set her teacup upon its saucer, adjusted the blue wool in her hands, and began again from the dropped stitch she had left waiting. The needles clicked softly, steady and certain, their rhythm the same as the world's own slow repair. For in St. Mary Mead, as in life itself, the quiet patterns always re-emerged, the truths always surfaced, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever watchful, would be there to see them come round once more. The end